Hi, this is Dr. John Bergsma from the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology and Franciscan University of Steubenville. And here we are on Wednesday of the 20th week of Ordinary Time. Please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell for these video casts if you appreciate them. We would very much appreciate it on our part if you follow us, like us, subscribe us, whatever you can do there, depending on the platform that you are viewing this on. And let's jump into the readings for today. So we have some bizarre readings, or at least I should say a bizarre reading in the first reading for this daily Mass. And it comes from one of the more bizarre books of the Bible, which is the book of Judges. See, Judges is an account of a very tumultuous time in the history of the people of Israel. The theme of the book of Judges is this, and it's articulated twice in the book, in particular with the last verse of the book, where it says, "There was no king in Israel at that time. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." Okay, so we're talking about a time of moral relativism. When everyone did what was right in their own eyes, that means everybody was their own moral compass, everybody was their own standard. There was not a strong central authority, because it says there was no king in Israel at that time. There was no one who was enforcing a standard of morality for all of society. So things were completely chaotic and everybody was just doing their own thing. And what we see in the book of Judges is the kind of chaos that results in the people of God when there is no strong central moral authority, when there isn't a bishop, when there isn't a pope, etc. It's kind of like, I hate to say this, but it's kind of like Protestantism, when everybody is their own moral compass and everyone makes their own judgment about how to interpret the Word of God. So in the particular case that we have in Judges 9, we have this crazy episode in the history of the people of Israel where they actually make a king for themselves. Now, usually you think of the kings of Israel, well, Saul was the first king, and then his son-in-law David took over, and then the line of David continued. But there's this mostly forgotten episode much earlier in Israel's history where they actually appointed a king for themselves from among the sons of Gideon, whose other name was Jerubbaal. So you remember Gideon early on in the book of Judges. He's from the tribe of Manasseh, and he drives out the Midianites who had been terrorizing the people of Israel. And he became something like a ruler, but he did not take the title king. But then after his death, they made one of his sons by the name of Abimelech king over themselves in Shechem, which is a city centrally located in the nation of Israel that straddles the tribal territory of Ephraim and Manasseh. So they all gather together in Shechem. Shechem's a very important city in the Old Testament. It's where Joseph was buried. It's where Joshua gathered the tribes to renew the covenant just before Joshua's death. So a very important sacred city in Israel. The tribes gather together. They make this son of Gideon king over them. But another son of Gideon, who had escaped the assassination of most of the sons, this is very complicated, but Abimelech, who's being made king here, he had his brothers assassinated, but he missed one, the youngest, Jotham. And Jotham goes up on Mount Gerizim. Later, a temple would be built there where the Samaritans worshipped. And Jotham tells this long story where the trees of the forest try to get different trees to rule over them, and none of the trees will agree to be king until they come to this weed, basically this buckthorn, and this weed agrees to become king over them. And that's basically an insult to his half-brother Abimelech, who's being made king over Israel. And the implication is you're placing a weed over you because there's no dignified trees to be your king. So very bizarre episode, what does it illustrate for us? It illustrates the kind of chaos that results, again, when everybody just does what's right in their own eyes, when everybody functions as their own moral compass. There's no prophet here to provide guidance. They are not seeking guidance from the Word of God, from the Scriptures, from Moses. They are not seeking the Lord's will through the priests at the tabernacle. They're just doing whatever they want. And so that's a warning for us as the people of God. We are not to be our own moral compass. We are not just to listen to our heart, okay, and do what feels good, feels so right, can't be wrong, etc., rocking and rolling, etc. No, we don't follow our instincts, our heart, our whims. We should seek for God's will through the priesthood that He has left us, through the Scriptures which He has left us, and through our proper pastors, which are first of all our local bishop. Yes, our leaders can often be imperfect and they are sinful, but you see that in the Bible. You see kings like Saul and David were sinful, and yet they were the Lord's anointed one. And it was right for the people of Israel to submit to their rule as long as they were in office, because the consequences are worse. The consequences of just throwing off all guidance and all authority and everybody doing what they think is right leads to chaos, destruction, and death for the people of God. All right, enough on that. Let's go on to the gospel. It's the parable of the vineyard owner. We know this well. This man owns a vineyard. He keeps going out to the marketplace at different times of the day. He finds guys standing around not doing anything, and he keeps hiring them and sending new folk to work in his vineyard. And at the end of the day, they all get the same pay. This can be understood in many different ways, but what I would focus on is that our reward for working for God in this life is God's self. And this denarius, or this daily wage, this coin, it is a denarius in the original language, which is basically the coin that was worth about $50 in modern equivalent. That was the typical wage for a day laborer. And they all get that same wage. They all get that same coin. What I would say is, those of us that are laboring in the vineyard of the Lord in this life, we are all paid with the same wage, which is the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is God's self. Okay? So we all receive the same wage. Whether we work a little or whether we work a lot, we receive Christ in the Eucharist. And somebody may say, well, why is that fair? Well, this is the thing. When we co-labor with God, it expands our capacity to receive. So if we indeed have borne the heat of the day and suffered with Christ, we have our capacity to receive God increased. And so even though each one of us receives the same pay, which is God Himself in the Eucharist in this life, in a more direct way in the life to come, those that have had the privilege of bearing the heat of the day and the privilege of sharing in the sufferings of Christ in this life in various ways, we will have our capacity to appreciate and to enjoy the divine presence, using a term that St. Augustine often uses, like in his On Christian Doctrine, or De Doctrina Christiana, one of his major works. He talks about enjoying God, that we should not use God, but we should enjoy God. And our capacity to enjoy God's presence is increased through suffering. So brothers and sisters, this is why God sends us sufferings. And this is why sometimes we labor for God and we're like, where is this all leading? Well, what's happening is our capacity to enjoy God is being increased. And so all of us are going to receive God in heaven. All of the elect will receive the same wage, which is God Himself. But those who've had the privilege to suffer will have a deeper experience of God. And that is well worth the temporary sufferings that we experience in this life, to have that deeper savor of the delights of God that we will receive in heaven. So I think that's one of the meanings of this parable. May it comfort us as we experience suffering, maybe even this day in this life. This has been Dr. John Bergsma coming to you from the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology and Franciscan University of Steubenville, wishing you a happy and holy Wednesday of the 20th week of Ordinary Time.